The city of Chicago originated as a settlement attached to a lone military outpost. It was located at the end of a canal which linked the Mississippi River to the southwest shore of Lake Michigan. It did not take long for the city to prosper. In Chicago's early days, the river was the main transportation route, but it was not long before the railroad would adopt that role. By the late 1800s, the Iron Horse was responsible for Chicago becoming a major center of commerce in the Midwest. Rail activity in Chicago's hub pales today in comparison to the golden days after the turn of the 20th century when Chicago was everyone's destination. In Chicago's early days, the city streets were built in a grid pattern, which allowed for the orderly settlement from the river to the north and to the west. For those not owning a horse, it became increasingly difficult to commute to work downtown. In 1853, Chicago's first fixed-route omnibus service was started by Franklin Parmalee. As the city grew, so too did the service. However, since the dirt roads would become impassable in bad weather, service was unreliable. As a result, omnibuses could only provide reliable service between hotels and railway stations. As time passed, horse car lines were introduced on fixed-track routes, where there were a greater number of riders and hence greater profits. Mass transit in Chicago can be said to have begun in 1858. When the Common Council passed laws allowing horse car operation on State and Madison Streets, as well as Cottage Grove Avenue. In 1859, the Chicago City Railways Company was formed. In April of that year, a single-track line on State Street from Madison to 12th was opened. It was served by 2 horse cars similar to this. They were 20 feet long and 7 feet wide, with a single bench seat on each side of the car running its entire length. A coal lamp illuminated the interior. The bobtailed cars could only be entered from the rear. The front platform was enclosed by a waist-high, semicircular dash, which exposed the operator to the weather. Later, cars seating 30 passengers were pulled by 2 horses. Horse cars proved to be inadequate in handling the ever-increasing ridership on main routes. As horses became more impractical, cable car operation using former horse cars were introduced to Chicago in 1871. As a result, all horse car operation ended in 1882. As time passed, it became apparent that cable cars were also prone to breakdowns and were too costly to run. Enter the electric transit technology. It had been successful in other cities, and now it was Chicago's turn. In the early 1890s, the Calumet Electric Street Railway was the first community in the area to use electric streetcars. Located in the far southeastern part of Chicago, a small number of tiny cars, such as number 4, began service. Equipped with a potbelly stove for heat, electric interior lights, and handbrakes, they became very popular with the public. In summertime, open electric cars would bring bathers to the lake to cool off. Competing companies began purchasing electric cars, as they were economical to operate and maintain. Soon they began operating downtown. From 1895 to 1906, Archer Avenue electric cars were hauled behind State Street cable car trains. They ran on a short stretch of Archer Avenue because there was no overhead trolley wire on the street. In June 1906, the city authorized a temporary electrification of certain Chicago City Railway lines. This temporary measure lasted for 50 years. Most of the cable car operations in Chicago were gradually replaced by electric streetcars. By the turn of the century, the smaller trolley companies had merged to form the Chicago Surface Lines. Chicago City Railway and Chicago Railways maintained their identity under the new Chicago Surface Lines. A pay-as-you-enter fare collection system was introduced. By the 1930s, the Chicago Surface Lines had over 15 different types of double-truck cars, 100 of these Peter Witt sedan-style cars were amongst the first order delivered in 1929 to Chicago Railways. Later, 40 additional Witts went to the Chicago City Railways Company. While sharing the Chicago Surface Line's banner, the two companies placed separate orders for cars which preserved their separate numbering system. These were Chicago's first single-ended center-exit cars. They were assigned to the Clark-Wentworth line, as well as the Fifth Avenue branch of the Madison line, because those lines had loops. The cars had automatic acceleration, which was a Surface Line's first. This allowed for smoother pickups and greater passenger comfort. Such improvements were necessary because trolley expansion had reached its peak. Chicago Surface Lines purchased many shapes and styles of trolleys over the years. The most common was the double-ended rear entrance car. While the Peter Witts were more modern, they could only be used on routes with loops and were not suitable for many routes. In the 1930s, competition from the Chicago Motor Coach Company threatened the Chicago Surface Lines franchise. They also faced competition from the steam railroads and the rapid transit lines, who had many stations within the city limits. This placed a strain on profits. Some of the railroads passing through the city were the Chicago Rock Island and Pacific, Chicago Western and Indiana, Chicago and Northwestern, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Illinois Central Railroad. All these railroads crisscrossed the city, causing delays for surface line trolleys at the numerous level crossings. There were overpasses and underpasses, but it was the level crossings that delayed the trolleys. This is an example of competition at work, as a Rock Island commuter train blocks 111th Street. The passengers get off the suburban train to make their trolley connection. It is also evident the need for two men on the streetcars, a motorman to operate the car and a conductor to collect the fares. The conductor also performs the task of a watchman to make sure there are no oncoming trains. He had to be nimble, getting off and on the moving car. Since most fan movies are taken on sunny, clear days, we have no record on film of a conductor performing his watchman task when the weather was bad. This scene shows what was called a shoe-fly operation. While the track work was under repair, the cars would cross over to the opposite track, going around the repair area. A temporary shoe-fly track was placed over the existing track, providing a temporary spring switch, allowing the cars to pass by without the aid of a switchman. When Foster Palmer took these movies in 1949, some of the veteran cars were still in service. 322 and 241 were part of an order of 600 cars which were built by Pullman in 1908. Known as the Old or Big Pullmans, they ran mainly on the north side. They were first put into service on Madison and ended their days on Ashland Halstead, Downtown, and the Kedzie, California lines. They were Chicago's last two-man conventional cars. The Lake Park Stony Island line was home to the new Pullmans. 350 were purchased by Chicago Railway in 1910. These 40-seat cars were shorter and narrower, but slightly higher than the old Pullmans. They were pay-as-you-enter cars, PAYE for short. By physically separating boarding and exiting, the pay system reduced passenger accidents and boarding times, as well as making fare collection simpler. Running times were reduced. 50 cars were purchased in 1909, which were nicknamed the pressed steel cars. They were so constructed as to reduce fire risk and maintenance costs, and were mainly in service on the Blue Island 26th route. In 1923, 169 cars were purchased from Brill and Cummings Car Company. Similar to earlier CSL cars, they were converted to one-man cars with new folding doors. This car, 6218, is the last in a series of 19 cars built by the Chicago Surface Lines in 1924. The other 19 were built by Lightweight Noiseless of Minneapolis. Originally running in multiple unit two-car trains, they were converted in the early 1930s to one-man operation and are seen here on the 93rd 95th Street line because the railway crossings here were manned, so a conductor was not needed to spot the steam trains. As the personal automobile became more numerous, less riders took the trolleys to work. The stripe on the front of the car shows riders that it is a front entrance car. Lake Michigan is in the background, with Jackson parked to the left of a CSL-built car 3231 as it crosses over to the inbound track to resume its service run. Chicago Surface Line cars were equipped with many new innovations when they first went into service. They had interlocking step mechanisms that flipped down a step when the door opened and folded it up when the door was closed. This feature was installed on all cars. The offside doors were manually operated with a step interlock. This scene at Lake Street shows 3 distinct rail corridors: the Steam Railroad line, the at-grade L line, and the Lake Street Trolley line. Car 6165 was one of 169 cars acquired in 1963 to first sport the red and cream livery. Built in 1921, it originally hauled trailers. In 1950, it was converted to one-man operation, and its sliding doors were replaced with folding ones. Running out of Kedzie Car House, they were Chicago's last conventional one-man cars. The 400 Brill cars of the 5201 to 5600 series had to be CSL's most reliable cars. Few of them have been written off when equipment retirements began in 1945. They were also durable, as one can see on this rough stretch of track on Summit Avenue. A Rock Island train passes by a man waiting on a pedestrian island. An outbound trolley on Vincennes Avenue paces the train. The 1906 Brill-built streetcars had distinctive window arches, which made them easy to spot. 2 Brills on the same track meet at the Baltimore and Ohio crossing. As is their routine, each conductor leaves his car to check for approaching trains. The trolley poles in the cars are almost vertical because the trolley wire is higher to clear the intersecting steam train. At 109th Street, the private right-of-way ends, and the car tracks veer into the middle of the road. These cars had a loading capacity of 75 riders per minute and seated 40 passengers. They were the first cars to include inside advertisements between the top window and the transom. Outside advertisements were not allowed. This was a practice that continued until the end of streetcar operation. In 1914, it was agreed to consolidate all the smaller streetcar lines, a practice that had begun with the merging of the South Chicago City Railway and the Calumet Electric Street Railway. This merger allowed the through routing of cars on the Cottage Grove route on Chicago City Railway tracks. Our outbound trip on the number 8 line takes us from Vincennes slightly northwest along Monterey to Hale Avenue, where the cars meet the Chicago Rock Island and Pacific Railway's suburban tracks. It's here Monterey Avenue ends, and the trolleys continue due west up the hill on 111th Street. The approaching cars are beginning their long inbound trip downtown. In 1914, the Chicago Surface Lines originated as a union between the Chicago City Railways Company and the Chicago Railways. The two companies continued to purchase rolling stock separately. That's why we see the same cars from the same order with completely different fleet numbers. The ratio of cars to each company was also different. It was usually 60-40 in favor of Chicago Railways. The advantages of this union were immediate. In addition to increasing the number of cars on the routes, riders could now make continuous trips without transferring and paying an extra fare. Initially, the service lost money in total. But as more riders took advantage of the increased convenience of this seamless ride, revenues rose and eventually profits increased. The Western Avenue line was one of the longest streetcar lines in Chicago. At almost 20 miles, it ended in South Chicago at 111th Street without a loop or a track connection. Pullman 883 crosses over to the inbound track, while 1728 awaits its turn to resume service. The Halstead line was a major north-south trunk line. It ended in the middle of the street at 111th and Sacramento Avenue near the Grand Trunk Railway at Mount Greenwood. When Foster Palmer shot these movies in June of 1949, it would only be 6 more months before service below 79th would be by motor bus. It ended over 40 years of streetcar service on this portion of the line. It had become apparent by the mid-1930s that streetcar companies had to attract new patrons and win back riders who had abandoned streetcar riding for private automobiles. The Chicago Surface Lines, in cooperation with other city streetcar companies, took steps to develop a modern streetcar. J.G. Brill Company and Pullman provided prototypes to demonstrate the new modern technology at the 1934 Chicago's World's Fair. After testing Pullman 4001 and Brill 7001, it was decided in 1935 that the St. Louis Car Company would be the builder of the 83 President's Conference Committee cars, the PCCs. The order was split in two. 4002 to 4051 went to Chicago Railways, and 7001 to 7034 for Chicago City Railways. At 50 feet 5 inches, these were the longest single-ended PCCs ever built. The Chicago PCCs seated 58 passengers with ample room for standees. They were designed for two-man operation. The cars, as delivered, allowed patrons to enter through the front 3 doors, proceed down the car to the conductor station in the middle of the car, pay their fare, and exit either by the center double doors or the single rear door. This was a pay-as-you-pass operation. The PCCs provided more passenger comfort than older equipment. The new cars had high-intensity lighting, forced air ventilation, leather-upholstered seats, easier access to the car with lower steps, smoother acceleration and braking. They had resilient wheels with cushioned padding, providing a softer ride. The extra width of the cars resulted in the body being mounted 3 inches off-center to the curbside on their trucks. This was done so the track clearances could be maintained as the cars passed each other. The car was equipped with hand controls rather than foot pedals. This arrangement satisfied the union that there would be no job loss. The motorman had to keep one hand on the brake lever and the other hand on the accelerator lever, much as he had to do on the older equipment. The conductor would collect the fares, issue transfers, and be the watchman at the railway crossings. In 1945, tiger stripes were added to the front of the cars to make them more visible to motorists. The car's front windows were hinged so that they could be easily opened. Air could enter the car, but there wasn't any airflow ventilation. The windshield wiper blades were transverse. They operated from a housing at the top of the window in a side-to-side motion. Lubricant droppings would occasionally drop onto the window, and when the wipers were turned on, they would smear across the windshield, obstructing the motorman's vision. While other PCC properties sealed the front windows and placed the wiper mechanism below the window, CSL did not. Metal bars were attached to the window openings to prevent riders from sticking their arms out. The cars eventually received ventilation alterations. The rear windows were hinged so that they would open. Mechanical changes and truck work was also done. Early in their service, the trolley wheels were replaced with sliding shoes, which prevented overhead wire wear. A number of door configurations were tried. In one case, a panel replaced one of the center doors. In 1940, one car, 4051, was converted from a 3-door front entrance, 2-door center exit, 1-door rear exit, to a 3-door rear entrance, 1-door center exit, 2-door front exit car. The conductor's station was moved opposite the rear doors. This served as the prototype for the new order of post-war PCC cars. Beyond 111th Street, the Cottage Grove line runs on a single track with passing sidings to the end of the line. These cars started their service life on Madison. They then went to 63rd and then to Cottage Grove, where they replaced the Peter Witts. It was when they went into service there that the post-war forest green and cream livery was applied. One car, 4016, had its rear door sealed. When the Cottage Grove line was converted to bus operation in 1955, the cars ran on Western Avenue and were retired less than a year later. After the Second World War, Chicago's population expanded to the suburbs. Prosperity abounded. The factories that had been geared for war production were retooled for domestic use. The workforce grew, and so too did Chicago's Surface Line's fleet. New cars were needed to supplement the old reliables. 310 Pullman-built PCCs were delivered in 2 series beginning in 1945 and 1946. Numbered 4062 to 4371, they were placed in service on Chicago's heaviest routes, Clark Wentworth and Broadway State. These cars were crowd swallowers with their 3 rear-loading doors, like the old Pullmans and Brill. The cars had something similar to a rear platform. The conductor was stationed just ahead of the rear doors. Riders would board, and the conductor would close the doors, allowing the car to take off while the passengers filed by, paying their fares. By the time the car reached the next stop, the passengers would be seated. The St. Louis Car Company also supplied 10 PCCs equipped for 2-man operation to Chicago Railways in 1947. In 1948, an additional 40 cars were delivered. When Pullman Standard and St. Louis Car Company built PCCs arrived in Chicago in the mid-1940s, the car's body were painted a mercury green color with a Croydon cream top and a swamp holly orange strip below the window line. Chrome wings flanked the golden glow headlight. Dash lights were also added to illuminate the front of the car. 3 chrome stripes were placed above the chrome bumper. Heavy-duty windshield wipers were installed, and a folding window was cut into the passenger side front window to provide ventilation for those steamy Chicago summers. In 1947, the non-operating Chicago Transit Authority had contemplated an order for 800 PCC cars. This idea evaporated shortly after CTA gained control of the Chicago Surface Lines September 30th, 1947. Deliveries of PCCs already ordered were made to fulfill contracts. However, a streetcar line abandonment program was put into place. August 1, 1948, the Western Line was cut back from 111th Street to 79th Street in the south, from Western and Howard to Shriver Loop at Clark and Devon in the north. These PCCs replaced older equipment. In December of 1948, the northern terminus was cut back to the Western Berwyn off-street loop. Early PCC abandonments include the 63rd Street route, a 10-mile line that had received the Green Hornets, as these cars were affectionately called, in November of 1952. They ran on the line until the end of service in May 1953. The Madison 5th Line quit in December of 1953 and was converted to motorbus. The 15.5-mile Cottage Grove Line, which ran from the Loop to 115th Street, ended service on June 19, 1955. As the 1950s began, more and more people were using their automobiles for personal transport, which cut heavily into non-rush hour revenues. As a result, ridership and revenues spiraled down. Rapid transit revenues increased as more riders drove to the rapid stations to board the trains. The Green Hornets still transported rush-hour crowds, but their operation and maintenance costs were high compared to buses. The cost burden of 2-man crews on half-empty cars also became a financial liability. As a result, on many car lines, substitute buses took the place of the trolleys. One exception was the Western Avenue Route 49. This 15.75-mile line was heavily traveled, and bus service was inadequate, so PCC service resumed in 1952 and continued until abandonment on June 15, 1956. Chicago's showcase PCC line was Broadway State Route 36. It was reported to be, at the time, the longest continuous streetcar line in the world. At 25.5 miles long, 150 Green Hornet PCCs were required to maintain service. PCC service on this line began December 15, 1947. At its zenith, the route ran from Broadway and Devon in the north to 119th Street and Morgan in the south. The State Street portion of the line closed December 5, 1955, while the Broadway section continued until abandonment February 16, 1957. The 20-mile Route 22 Clark-Wentworth line ran from Howard in the north to 81st Street and Halstead in the south. It was the first route to run all electric PCCs in 1947, and it was also the last to run them, with the Clark portion quitting on September 7, 1957. When PCC 7213 pulled into the car barn at 77th and Vincennes on Chicago's south side, June 21, 1958, a tradition of almost 100 years of streetcar operations in Chicago ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. But some of the PCCs, as we shall see later, were given a second life. Today, only one of Chicago's 600 PCC streetcars remain. Visitors to the Illinois Railway Museum can ride on 4391, which has been restored by museum volunteers, complete with hand controls, to its as-delivered condition. A number of other Chicago Surface Line cars, including 1374, one of 323 Little St. Louis Car Company trolleys, have also been restored for riding. Chicago's railway in the sky, the Elevated, began similar to the steam railway in New York City. Small Baldwin steam engines would pull converted railway cars along an elevated track. This system of moving riders was necessary because of the growing shortage of street space for horse cars. The Chicago and Southside Rapid Transit Company constructed the first elevated track. Service began on May 27, 1892, with 300 invited guests riding a 6-car train in the alley adjacent to State Street from Congress Street to 39th. Chicago's Elevated originally started out as 5 separate companies, 4 of which actually ran cars on elevated track. The Chicago and Southside Rapid Transit Railroad, Lake Street Elevated, Metropolitan West Side Elevated, Northwestern Elevated, and Union Elevated all leased their track in the downtown loop. And the loop was the heart of the elevated system. Originally called the Union Loop by the builder, today the entire area is known as the Loop. Steam elevated railways soon became impractical and costly. When the Chicago and Southside Rapid Transit Company went bankrupt, a new company was formed. The Southside Elevated Company began operation in January 1897. They retained Frank J. Sprague, who had developed a multiple unit control system that allowed one man to operate a number of cars coupled together. Introduced in 1897, this was the most important event in the history of electric railways. This simplified operation provided a cost saving that could be reinvested. Sprague equipped a number of Southside cars with electric lights. heaters, motors, and braking systems. By October 1897, the old Congress Street stub was closed and passenger trains were running on the loop. After trial runs, full service of electric MU cars began July 27, 1898. Early elevated cars had open platforms where the conductors were stationed. Most of the rolling stock, including the motors and trailers, were built by Pullman, but Barney and Smith, American Car and Foundry, and Jewett also provided equipment. From the turn of the century to the mid-1920s, there were a number of extensions: Humboldt Park, Douglas Park, Garfield Park, and also Forest Park. Evanston, Ravenswood, Des Plaines, Dempster, Linden, all these new stations increased ridership dramatically. In 1914, the Chicago Elevated Railway received 62 motors and 66 trailers from the Cincinnati Car Company. They featured all steel-bodied construction, Armco iron-arched roofs, wide center doors, and closed wide vestibules. They were nicknamed Baldies because they had few ventilators on their smooth, contoured roof. An additional 122 motor units were acquired, equipped with transverse seats. The subway-style center door was replaced when the next order was delivered in 1922. On August 6, 1919, the North Shore Line began service on L tracks, linking Chicago with Milwaukee. Through a series of cooperative agreements, North Shore trains provided 1/2 hour service over Chicago's elevated track to a downtown terminal at Roosevelt Road. The service made full use of the L's Express track. The North Shore received additional excursions and charter business as groups could now be picked up at L stations. In 1924, 100 additional Cincinnati-built cars were acquired. By the mid-1920s, the Chicago's elevated fleet numbered 1,906 cars. The new cars had green plush seats, wooden floors, glass shades on overhead lights, electric fans, and mahogany wood trim. In 1924, the 4 independent elevated railway companies merged to form the Chicago Rapid Transit Company. The former company's lines now became divisions. The result of this merger was a $5 million improvement plan that included lengthening station platforms in the loop to accommodate 8-car trains. The platform lengthening project lasted until 1932, when there was a downturn in ridership due to the Depression. In 1926, a 5-mile high-speed 2-track line joining Howard Station to Dempster Street was opened to divert North Shore trains from the slower Shoreline route. The Skokie Valley Bypass, as it was called, rejoined North Shore's main line near North Chicago. This allowed the company's faster Milwaukee-bound through trains to save 20 minutes by avoiding the local route. Ridership levels and profits had risen in the 1920s until the early 1930s, when the effects of the Depression reduced the workforce. Riders almost disappeared. The company's financial problems were not completely solved until the 1940s, when wartime traffic increased. After the war, prosperity returned, and ridership continued to grow. By this time, it was the antique rolling stock that was ready for retirement. Patronage on surface streetcar lines had declined, while rapid ridership had continued at near wartime levels. Foster Palmer took these movies in the late 1940s from the bridge linking the 2 platforms at Randolph and Wells Station, looking north along Wells. The lift bridge over the Chicago River closes. The Lake Street crossing is in the foreground. It was, at one time, the busiest crossing in the world. A Lake Street train enters the loop. At this time, both the inner and outer trains ran in the same direction. Older cars ran on this section, while newer cars ran in the subway. These views were taken from inside a Lake Street train and show another train inbound for Logan Square. Looking south from Lake and Wabash, one can just catch a glimpse of a gas bus and a CSL trolley below the elevated. The loop was built in stages, and the section on Wabash between Lake and the Adams Street Station was placed in service November 8, 1896. On September 6, 1897, a test train almost caused a riot. A motor and 3 trailers made 3 trips around the loop. Passers-by and downtown workers attempted to board the train when it stopped along the line. It took 50 employees some time to convince those who crowded the platforms that it was just a test train. Full loop service began October 3, 1897. One of 4 daily PM rush hour trains arrives at the site of the former Southside L terminus from the main line alley elevated. At 41st Street, the Southside line veers east for a few blocks. The Indiana station was located on this short east-west section. It then veers south to Jackson Park. In this view, a Kenwood train departs. A northbound train passes over Garfield Boulevard in a 1948 scene. In 1954, Foster Palmer captured the Garfield Park elevated portion of the old Metropolitan line running at grade. At this time, the I-290 Eisenhower Expressway was just being built. A westbound train comes down the incline. The trains ran on Van Buren Street, just north of the expressway construction, from Racine to Sacramento. A train from Douglas Park, no longer able to turn east at Marshfield, is on its way north to the Lake Street line, where it will turn east, following Lake Street to the loop. An outbound Garfield train crosses Western Avenue, holding up a Green Hornet. There were guards at all level crossings because of third rail operations and the importance of keeping up to schedule. When the Metropolitan Elevated built the Garfield Park extension at the turn of the 20th century, it was not long before the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago interurbans began running on their tracks. This railway was a complete third rail operation. Most of the interurban railways at the time powered their trains by overhead catenary or trolley wire. By granting a 50-year franchise to the AE&C, the Metropolitan Elevated allowed the linking of the Fox River communities with the Chicago Loop. In the 1950s, the surrounding communities relied heavily on this commuter connection, as one can see by these crowded trains. By 1954, this area was built up. It was not the case 30 years earlier, however. In October 1926, a mile-long extension of the line beyond Des Plaines Terminal was built south to Roosevelt Road by the Chicago Rapid Transit Company. It was intended to promote development of a tract of land owned by the president of the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railroad. The short extension also served to relieve the interurban line of short-haul traffic in the area. In December 1930, a single-track extension to 22nd Street and Manheim Road opened. Patronage was light, and the line was abandoned in 1951. Ironically, a few years later, the communities in the area had a surge in development. Marshfield Station was where the Logan Square and Humboldt Park lines turned north, and the Douglas Park trains went south. In 1904, the Metropolitan invested $1 million to build a 4-track terminal at present-day Wells Street in Quincy. The Fifth Avenue Terminal, as it was then called, was soon operating 114 rush-hour trains daily. In March 1905, the AE&C won a franchise bid to operate to downtown Chicago, and their trains began immediately to use the downtown facility. The single-story Wells Terminal was replaced in 1929 by a 3-story terracotta-clad building. Almost 7 miles from the loop, the Lake Street line came down to street level. Trains ran adjacent to the Chicago Northwestern Railway track embankment on a private right-of-way. When they ran on the elevated portion, they were powered by third rail. At grade, the cars received power from overhead wires through the trolley pole. The Northwestern Elevated Railway extended service from the Loop to Evanston in May of 1908. The North Shore interurbans provided commuter service between Milwaukee and the Chicago Loop. In the 1940s, the Electroliners were introduced to the North Shore line. These 2 train sets provided luxury service on the line. Built by St. Louis Car Company, the articulated train sets carried about 90 passengers each at speeds topping 90 miles per hour, providing 2-hour service. Riders could dine on a variety of snacks, including the famous Electra Burger, made fresh in the onboard snack bar. These shots were taken from the rear platform of a local inbound train on the section of track between Sedgwick and Chicago Station. At this time, the express North Shore trains ran on the inner track to and from the loop. By the time these movies were taken in 1948, the Chicago Rapid Transit Company had already made plans for the next generation of rapid cars. While railroad-style cars with coach seats were acceptable for longer distances, a more practical car was required for the commuter. In 1939, the CRT built a mock-up of a steel rapid car, employing PCC technology. But low revenues and the Second World War postponed development of the car for over 5 years. In 1947, Chicago Rapid Transit Company purchased 4 articulated train sets, 2 from Pullman Standard, numbered 5001 and 5002, and 2 from St. Louis Car Company, 5003 and 5004. Originally all silver colored, the aluminum-bodied cars were lightweights with 2 prominent headlights and 2 trolley shrouds that protected the poles. Revenue service began in September of 1947. The Pullmans came equipped with Clark Special Rapid B2 trucks, while the St. Louis cars had B4 trucks. In the Skokie Swift service, the cars ran in mercury green and cream livery, and the poles were replaced with pantographs. This experimental unit found a home at the Fox River Trolley Museum and was restored back to service by museum volunteers. One such volunteer gives a brief description of the car and some of its features.
Controls here for the pans and everything. These were put on for Skokie Swift service when they ran it with a remote pan, because they could run with one person, and so that's why these things are here. And they just, of course, that was all taken off. See, for the last trips of the car, which were a couple of Chargers, we took this out to O'Hare and everything, and the Kimball subway is got real low clearance, so everything was taken off of the roof. Joe said he's content to so he's the next one. That they did do to it, a couple of things that they did. If you want, I can go on camera. The original seats were a green mohair. This is later CTA. Also, right here, these had crank windows, and then they converted it to just the regular pop-up windows. Here's your articulated joint, and then here's your
In fact, you can see they're kind of falling and disintegrating.
When they put it together, the conductor's position was in this open door, so he had to go ahead, look out of the car, pop back in, and then hit the door switch. CTA wanted the conductor to be able to check the sides of the cars as they come in and out of the platforms. So this was one feature that was eliminated from the 6000s. The standard, was the first of the beginning of the standard CTA door opening systems. They're pretty much standard today. This control panel has 3 positions for each of the compartments has its own door. Right now we got them cut out in the other doors, and this was their first equipment the door is interlocked with the controller. So I cannot run this train unless I close the door and get a green light on my control panel there. To close the door, just push and then the key comes out and the control panel is locked up. The car, you got to remember the last years, from 64 on, 20 years, it was basically in Skokie Swift service. It was always in Skokie Swift service, so it wasn't getting the beat-up job that everybody else, all the other cars would do.
There were no other orders for the experimental cars, as they were too long, not suitable for the tight curves of some lines. Chicago Rapid Transit wanted a shorter car that could be operated in married pairs. They ordered 200 all-electric, 48-foot-long PCC combination subway elevated cars from St. Louis Car Company for delivery in 1950 and 1951. The only cosmetic feature retained was the dual front headlights. They resembled President's Conference Committee streetcars with the addition of standy windows, a front sign box, and blinker doors. The PCC Rapid cars were so well received that additional cars were ordered. The livery on the first order had mercury green paint over the roof, the standy window area, and just below the window line. The next order had the cream paint surrounding the entire window area. The interior was very PCC-like, complete with crank windows, armrests, and PCC-style lighting. The Chicago Transit Authority, which was created in 1947, reassigned these all-steel cars to the Ravenswood line and retired them in the mid-1960s. Rapid transit ridership grew as surface streetcar ridership fell. In 1953, it was decided to retire the PCC fleet and take all the useful parts to create a new rapid car. One of the reasons for using salvaged parts from the Green Hornets was the cost of a new rapid car. Other transit properties could not agree to a standardized car, and CTA could not afford to go it alone. So Chicago streetcars were shipped to St. Louis Car Company as the surface trolley lines were abandoned. This was so successful that 7 more orders were contracted until the contract was completed in 1960. Of Chicago's 600 post-war PCC streetcars, 570 were reborn as rapid transit cars. At St. Louis Car Company, the control contactors, motor generator sets, door engines, seats, windows, cranks, stanchions, lighting fixtures, wheels, trucks, and motor and drum brakes were all salvaged for installation in the new body shells. They were then shipped back to Chicago on a rail flat car. The old trolley bodies were scrapped. This was probably the first notable case of recycling. Because the Green Hornet trolleys had both General Electric and Westinghouse traction motors, CTA ordered all but a handful of cars fitted with the large Westinghouse accelerator, as were equipped on the earlier 6001 to 6200 series cars. This action avoided a potential maintenance headache. Of the 571 cars rebuilt between 1954 and 1959, 271 were permanently coupled in 2-car trains, and 240 were configured as married pairs. 40 had motormen's cabs at one end for single-car operation. The former trolley rebuilds were distinguished by a headlight over the front door, which replaced the sign box on the original order of cars. Their sign box was placed in the front window. The 600 series PCC Rapid cars entered service on the Logan Square Loop route. Looking north from Belmont Station, we see a Ravenswood 2-car train branch off the main line at Clark Junction. In off-peak hours, it was common to run married pair trains. In rush hours, it was not uncommon to have 8-car trains, while 6-car trains were average. On this occasion, there are 2 married pairs running. The 1950s saw the start of construction of the Eisenhower system of interstate freeways and tollways. The original Congress Street Expressway was extended west to join the Tri-State Tollway. While the expressway was being built, the Rapid Line continued to run. So too did the adjacent Northwestern Rail Line. The long covered passageways that joined the platforms to the street proved to be a design mistake. People using the passageways became victims of crime. This discouraged riders from using those stations. On Sundays, 2 cars were the norm, as many riders rode inbound to the loop from Forest Park or outbound from the loop. Other cities followed Chicago's lead by placing their rapid transit lines in the medians of expressways. With the addition of new rolling stock, some of the vintage equipment had their life extended as work cars. By far, the most aesthetically pleasing rapid cars ever ordered by the CTA were the 2000 series Pullmans. In 1964, 180 cars numbered 2001 to 2180 were built by the local Pullman plant on Chicago's South Side. These were the first cars to be built to CTA's own specifications. Gone were the standy windows. The cars were equipped with 125 horsepower motors and CTA 1 trucks and could attain a speed of 60 miles per hour. They were CTA's first air-conditioned rapid cars. They had all aluminum bodies and fiberglass fronts. The seats were powder blue in color. Front and side destination boxes were prominently displayed. The cars were at first assigned to the Lake Street Dan Ryan line, replacing older equipment. In 1965, some were assigned to the Douglas line. Being a unique car, they experienced numerous problems, but they served Chicago well for over 30 years and were retired in the late 1990s. While most transit vehicles running on the system in modern times ran on third rail, the Evanston section beyond Howard Station still ran on overhead trolley wire. At Howard Station, there was a modest storage and maintenance yard. Today, it is almost tripled in size. The PCC cars that shuttled the 7-mile Evanston line between Linden Station and Wilmette and Howard Station were double-ended with control cabs and trolley poles at each end. In the 1970s, the line was changed to third rail operation and the shuttle car trolley poles were removed. In January 1964, the Skokie Swift Line opened for business, operating on the former Skokie Valley route of the North Shore Line. That line had been abandoned a year earlier. Special PCC cars with cab controls and trolley poles at either end were placed in service. Later, bow pantographs were installed. The operator had controls in his cab that would allow him to automatically raise and lower the pantograph. Further down the line, it changed from overhead catenary wire to third rail. While the car was in motion, the operator would push a button and the pantograph would retract and the third rail shoe would make contact with the third rail to power the car. Skokie residents had fear of third rail accidents, so the continued use of overhead trolley wire has been in place since the line was first built. In 2003, it is said that third rail operation will finally be extended to Dempster. The familiar green CTA livery was replaced with the silver and black livery. The PCC cars ran on the line until they were replaced with newer cars in the late 1990s. In the 1990s, the PCC and Pullman rapid cars had reached the end of their service life. New equipment was on order and being delivered. The PCC and Pullman era in Chicago is ended, and the 21st century finds a new breed of rapid car providing service to Chicago transit riders. CTA's fleet has been modernized, and now MK cars and the Bud cars are in service. Many PCC fans from all over the world visited Chicago to ride the cars in regular service for the last time. Most of the cars were sold for scrap, but some were donated to museums. The historic cars were gladly accepted by transportation museums throughout North America. You can ride a PCC elevated train at the Illinois Railway Museum, located northwest of Chicago at Union, Illinois. One of Chicago's double-ended cars found a new home in Canada. In March 1999, the Halton County Radial Railway in Milton, Ontario, received CTA PCC number 48. Its trucks were removed by museum volunteers and replaced with the trucks from PCC 4602, so it could run on the museum's Toronto gauge track. 2 trolley poles were added for operation on the line, and it made its debut at the museum's 1999 Fall Extravaganza. It's the museum's first international acquisition.